Here's a phrase that sounds intimidating but describes something almost embarrassingly simple: the Anthropic Principle. You've probably heard it thrown around in debates about fine-tuning, sometimes as a knockdown counter-argument, sometimes as a phrase people use without fully explaining what it means. At its core, the Anthropic Principle says something like this: of course we observe a universe capable of supporting observers, because if it weren't capable of that, there'd be nobody around to observe it in the first place. It sounds almost too obvious to be interesting, but depending on how you use it, this simple observation gets stretched into wildly different conclusions, some modest and genuinely useful, others doing a lot more philosophical work than they first appear to. Today we're going to unpack what the Anthropic Principle actually is, walk through the different ways scientists interpret it, and look honestly at where it helps the fine-tuning conversation and where it doesn't actually solve what people think it solves. Let's start with where this idea actually comes from, because it wasn't invented to dodge a theological question. It started as a fairly mundane observational point. The physicist Brandon Carter coined the term Anthropic Principle in 1973, and the core insight is a kind of selection effect. If you're trying to explain why we observe certain conditions in the universe, you have to remember that our observations are automatically filtered by the fact that we exist to make them. We couldn't observe a universe hostile to observers for the simple reason that we wouldn't be there to do the observing. It's a bit like a fish being surprised that every body of water it's ever swum in contains water. Of course it does, because a waterless environment wouldn't have a fish in it to notice. Applied to fine-tuning, the reasoning goes like this. Physicists have discovered that the fundamental constants of the universe, the strength of gravity, the mass of the proton, the rate of cosmic expansion, all fall within an extremely narrow range required for life. Some people find that suspicious, maybe even evidence of design. The Anthropic Principle response says, not so fast. We shouldn't be surprised to find ourselves in a life-permitting universe, because a life-prohibiting universe is, by definition, one where nobody would be around to be surprised by anything at all. This basic version of the idea is usually called the weak anthropic principle, and it's genuinely useful. Most physicists across the spectrum, religious or not, accept it as a legitimate observational caution. Here's a clean example of how it functions. Suppose you're standing in a particular spot on Earth, and you notice the conditions there are just right for you to be alive. The right temperature, the right atmosphere, the right gravity. It would be a mistake to conclude something mysterious is going on, because obviously you can only be standing in a spot where those conditions hold. You'd never find yourself standing on the surface of the sun, taking careful notes about how surprisingly hospitable it is there, because you wouldn't survive to take the notes. The weak anthropic principle is really just a reminder to account for this kind of observer selection effect before jumping to conclusions about design or coincidence. This is legitimate. Careful reasoning and design proponents generally accept it as far as it goes. The disagreement starts when people try to use this simple observational caution to fully explain away the fine-tuning of the universe as a whole, which is a much bigger claim than the weak anthropic principle on its own actually supports. Here's the key distinction that often gets blurred in casual conversation, and it's worth being precise about it. The weak anthropic principle explains why, given that a life-permitting universe exists, we should expect to find ourselves inside it rather than somewhere else. That part is uncontroversial, but it does nothing to explain why a life-permitting universe exists in the first place out of the vastly larger range of possible universes that wouldn't have supported life at all. Those are two completely different questions, and the Anthropic Principle only genuinely answers the first one. Here's an illustration philosophers often use to make the difference clear. Imagine you're sentenced to face a firing squad of 100 expert marksmen, all aiming at you at close range. They fire, and somehow every single shot misses. You survive. Could you legitimately reason, well, of course I'm here to notice I survived. If they hadn't all missed, I wouldn't be alive to think about it. So there's nothing here that actually needs explaining. That would strike almost everyone as a strange, unsatisfying response. Yes, you have to be alive to notice you survived. That part's true and trivial. But the far more interesting question is still sitting right there, completely unanswered. Why did every expert marksman miss? Something clearly needs explaining, and you wouldn't be here to ask if they hadn't missed. Doesn't actually explain it. It just restates the fact that you're asking the question. Fine-tuning works the same way. Yes, we can only be having this conversation in a universe whose constants happen to fall within the narrow life-permitting range. That's true, and it's trivial. But the actual substantive question, why did the shots all miss? Why do the constants fall in that narrow range in the first place, out of all the ranges they could have taken, is left completely untouched by the weak anthropic principle. It answers the easy question and leaves the hard one exactly where it started. This is where a stronger, more ambitious version of the idea comes in, sometimes called the strong anthropic principle, and it's closely tied to the multiverse theory we covered a few episodes back. The strong version proposes that the universe, in some sense, must have life-permitting properties, either because there's some deeper physical necessity that requires it, or, in its more common modern form, because there are enough different universes out there, with enough different combinations of constants, that a life-permitting one was statistically bound to show up somewhere. And naturally, that's the one we find ourselves in. This is a genuinely different, much bigger claim than the modest, weak version, and it comes with the same limitations we discussed in the multiverse episode. It requires accepting the existence of a vast or infinite number of unobservable universes, a metaphysically heavy commitment to explain away the fine-tuning of the one universe we can actually observe and measure. And even granting all of that, it still runs into the same regress problem. Whatever mechanism supposedly generates all those different universes with their different constants has to itself be capable of producing exactly that kind of variation, which is its own remarkable, unexplained feature, requiring an explanation of its own. So, when people invoke the anthropic principle as though it single-handedly dissolves the fine-tuning problem, it's worth asking which version they actually mean. The weak version is true, but modest, it doesn't remove the mystery. The strong version tries to remove the mystery, but only by adding a substantial, unproven metaphysical structure to do it. So, explained simply, the anthropic principle, in its honest, modest form, is really just a reminder that we can only observe conditions compatible with our own existence. True, but far more limited than it's sometimes made out to be. It tells you why you're standing where you're standing. It doesn't tell you why the ground turned out to be solid in the first place. The deeper question, why the shots all missed, why the constants of this universe fall precisely within the narrow range that allows anyone to be here asking the question at all, remains exactly as open and exactly as striking as it was before anyone coined the phrase anthropic principle. Psalm 8 puts the same wonder in different words. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Maybe the honest answer to why we're here to ask isn't a selection effect at all. Maybe it's an invitation. Thanks for watching. If this gave you something to think about, consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.